The Spore Father called it a harvest, and harvests were not supposed to fight back. From the bridge of the seed carrier Eternal Bloom, Coordinator Ulthon Vesk watched the blue world swell in the forward bloom glass and felt the old, comfortable certainty settle in his thorax. 1,100 ships of the Mycelid Imperium hung in the dark behind him, arranged in the slow spiral their kind had used to swallow worlds for 9,000 years. They did not arrive as a fleet, they arrived as weather. They arrived the way rot arrives, quiet and total, and by the time anything understood it had been touched, it was already part of them. That was the doctrine, that was the faith. Vesk had recited it to younglings in the spore creches, and now he would prove it again above a planet the catalogs called Earth. His ships carried no shells. The Mycelid did not believe in shells. Their hulls were grown, not built, pale spires of hardened fungal bone that drank starlight and bled clouds of dormant spore when they needed to kill. Below decks, in chambers the size of cities, 11,000 tons of contaminant lay sleeping in pressurized bulbs, each strain bred to undo a different kind of life. There were spores that ate metal, spores that ate thought, spores that turned the water inside a body to a thin gray paste in under a minute. The Imperium did not conquer planets. It composted them, and grew something obedient in the soil afterward. Vesk had never once seen the doctrine fail. No one alive had. "Bloom glass to the surface," he said, and the chamber's living walls flexed and focused. Earth filled the view. It was a wet, loud, crowded little world, and the readings made his mandibles itch. Atmosphere thick with free oxygen, which to the Mycelid meant the place was practically begging to burn. Surface temperature in the band their spores loved best. Vast oceans of liquid water, a perfect medium, and life everywhere, layered and reckless and unguarded, the way prey worlds always were before they learned to be afraid. "Defenses," he said. His scan tender, a young drone named Os, fluttered its sensory fronds and reported in the flat sing-song the creches taught. One orbital structure of significance, coordinator. A ring station, low orbit, perhaps 4,000 of their meters across. Crude alloy. Slow rotation. We read 41 smaller vessels docked along its spine. None are moving. Many appear unpowered. Weapons aboard the station. Present but dormant. Their reactor signatures are low. By our measure, coordinator, the station runs at perhaps a third of its capacity. As if it sleeps. Vesk allowed himself the small clicking sound his people used for satisfaction. A sleeping guard. A planet that had not bothered to wake. He had taken 9 worlds in his service, and the easiest of them had at least been awake. Designation of the station? Os consulted the captured trade chatter the Imperium had been harvesting for 2 cycles. They call it Hearthring, coordinator, in their own tongue. It is described in their open broadcasts as a relay and a museum. A museum. The word translated badly into Mycelid thought, which had no concept of keeping a dead thing on purpose. Vesk did not waste a moment wondering what it meant. He had a harvest to begin. He turned from the glass and addressed the bridge, and through the spore link his voice reached every coordinator in every spire across 1,100 hulls. "We will not rush," he said. "We never rush. Spread the spiral. Seed the upper atmosphere first, the strains that blind and the strains that quiet, so the surface does not understand what is happening until it is happening to all of them at once. The ring station we leave for last. Let it watch its world die, then we compost it too, and grow a beacon in its place, so the next traders who pass this way will know the Imperium was here." 1,100 captains answered with the same word, the soft wet pulse that meant obedience. The spiral began to turn. And on the ring station the Mycelid had dismissed as a sleeping museum, in a cramped maintenance bay welded to the underside of the spine, a man named Garrick Pell was on his back, under a coolant manifold, swearing at a wrench. He was not a soldier. He was not a soldier. He wanted that understood, in the way a man wants things understood only to himself. Garrick Pell was a fitter, 3rd grade, 46 years old, with bad knees and a back that told him the weather, and a personnel file that listed his specialty as legacy systems, mechanical. He fixed old things. That was the whole of it. Hearthring was full of old things, and Garrick was the man they called when the old things stopped behaving, and that suited him fine, because old things did not shoot at you and did not expect you to be brave. He had heard the proximity tone 40 minutes ago. Everyone had. He had ignored it because the proximity tone went off twice a week when freighters came in wide, and the last thing a fitter needed was to go running every time a hull pinged the net. He had a manifold seal that was weeping, and a weeping seal became a flood, became a fire, and that was a real problem, unlike most things people panicked about. It was the silence that finally got him. Hearthring was never silent. It hummed. It always hummed, the deep, patient throb of a station that had been turning in the same orbit for 190 years, and a man who had spent half his life inside that hum learned to feel it in his teeth without noticing. Now the hum had changed. It had dropped and tightened, and underneath it Garrick felt something he had never felt in 19 years aboard. He felt the old girl waking up. He slid out from under the manifold, wrench still in his fist, and stood in the empty bay listening to lights come on that he had never seen lit. Panels he had been told for 2 decades were decommissioned. Dead boards, museum pieces, bolted shut, labeled with little brass plates that said "Do Not Service." They were glowing now. Down the length of the bay, one after another, the dead boards were opening their eyes. A voice came over the local channel. Not the duty officer, not anyone Garrick knew. A woman's voice, calm in the specific way that frightened him more than shouting would have. All Hearthring personnel, this is Warden Control. Stand by for Articus Protocol. I say again, Articus Protocol. This is not a drill, and this is not a museum anymore. Garrick Pell looked down at the wrench in his hand, then up at the lights coming on all around him, and said the only thing that seemed honest. Oh hell. The word Articus meant nothing to Garrick. It meant a great deal to the people the Mycelid could not see. Hearthring had been many things. The traders' broadcasts were not lying when they called it a relay and a museum, because that was true, and a true thing was the best place to hide another truth inside. The ring had been built 190 years ago, after the First War, the one no one outside Earth's own records remembered, the one humanity had won badly and barely. They had built the ring to hold what they learned in that war, and they had built it to look like exactly what it was now pretending to be, because a people who had survived being hunted once understood the value of seeming harmless. Inside the spine of the ring, behind the dead boards and the brass plates that read "Do Not Service," slept a warship. Not a ship docked at the station, not one of the 41 tired hulls the Mycelid had counted along the spine. Those were the decoys, old freighters and survey boats and a decommissioned patrol cutter, kept powered down on purpose, kept exactly as derelict as they looked. The warship was the station. The ring was its hull. 4,000 meters of armored bone steel and folded weapon spine wrapped into a wheel and set to spin in low orbit for 190 years, humming its patient hum, waiting for the day the proximity tone meant something. Its name was the Articus. The protocol and the ship were the same word, because the protocol was simple. When the day came, the ship would wake, and the ship would not be merciful, because mercy had nearly gotten the species composted the first time. Warden Control was a woman named Imre Solano, and she had trained for this morning for 30 years without ever once believing it would come. She sat at the heart of the ring, in a chamber that the museum tours never reached, surrounded by the slow green wakening of a mind that had slept since before her grandmother was born. The Articus did not have a crew in the way the Mycelid understood crews. It had wardens, 11 of them, scattered through the ring, each one paired to a quarter of the ship's waking self. The ship thought. The wardens chose. That was the bargain humanity had made with the thing it built after the First War, after it learned the hard way that a weapon you could not switch off would eventually decide it did not need you, and a weapon with no teeth would get you killed. The Articus had teeth and a leash, and Imre Solano held one strap of that leash, and her hands were steady. "Talk to me," she said. The ship answered in readings, not words, because it was not yet awake enough for words, and she preferred it that way. Power climbing through the spine. 1,100 contacts in the high dark, arranged in a spiral she recognized from the war records she had memorized as a cadet. A spiral so old and so specific that seeing it on her board made the hair stand up on her arms. The mycelid spiral, the composting pattern. They had a file on this exact maneuver, drawn by hand by the last warden of the First War, and she had studied that drawing until she dreamed in it. So it was them, after 190 years, it was them, come back to a world they had failed to swallow the first time, certain it would be easier now. "Hello again," Imre said softly, to no one. She keyed the all-station channel. 11 wardens, 212 support crew, the cooks and fitters and medics and clerks, who kept a 4,000-meter ring alive while it pretended to be asleep. Garrick Pell was one of them, on his back no longer, standing in a maintenance bay with a wrench and a stomach full of cold. "All hearthring personnel," Imre said. "This is Warden Control. Articus is waking. We have 1,100 mycelid hulls in the high orbit, in composting spiral, intent confirmed hostile. Your stations now. Support crew to your hard points. We have done this drill 400 times. We do it once more, for real, and then we go home." Garrick did not have a battle station. Fitters did not get battle stations. He had a wrench and a maintenance bay, and a manifold that was still, somewhere in all of this, weeping coolant onto the deck. He stood there a moment longer, and then his training, the dull, boring drill they ran twice a year, that he had always treated as a joke, took his legs out from under his fear and walked him toward the wall. There was a panel on the wall of every bay aboard Hearthring, a dead board with a brass plate. Garrick had walked past this one 19 years. The plate said, "Do not service." Underneath, in smaller letters he had never bothered to read, it said Warden Auxiliary, Spine Segment 9. And below that a thing Garrick had never understood until this exact moment, a handprint plate, the kind you only put on a thing that one day someone would need to open in a hurry. The board was glowing. The handprint plate was lit, a soft and patient green. Garrick Pell, fitter 3rd grade, put his hand on the plate. The wall opened. Far above, in the bloom glass of the eternal bloom, Coordinator Ulthon Vesk watched the ring station and felt, for the first time in 9 harvests, a small wrongness he could not name. "Os," he said, "report on the ring." The scan tender's fronds had gone rigid. "Coordinator, the structure is powering. Reactor signature climbing. It was at 1/3. It is now at 1/2. It is now at 2/3. A pause. The fronds trembled. "Coordinator, it has not stopped climbing." "A waking guard," Vesk said, and made the click of satisfaction again, though it cost him more effort this time. "Let it wake. 1 station against the Imperium. It will see us and despair, and then it will compost like everything else. Begin the seeding. Upper atmosphere, now." The order pulsed out through the spore link, and along the leading edge of the spiral, 40 seed carriers opened their growing vents and breathed. It was a beautiful thing, by mycelid lights. Pale clouds of dormant spore poured from the carriers in slow, majestic plumes, billions of microscopic seeds drifting down toward the upper air of Earth, where the warmth and the oxygen and the water would wake them, and they would begin the patient work of 9,000 years, the blinding strains, to take the eyes of the prey world's machines, the quieting strains, to still the panic before it spread. The Imperium did not bomb a world, it tucked it in. The plumes drifted down, and 90 kilometers above the surface, at the very top of the air, they met something that should not have been there. The Articus had not fired. That was the part Vesk would never understand, in the seconds he had left to try. The ring had not fired a single shot. It had simply, as it woke, unfolded the first of its weapon spines, and the weapon spine was not a gun. It was a field projector, an old and ugly piece of physics the First War had taught humanity, and humanity had never forgotten, and what it projected was heat. Raw, directed, indiscriminate heat, poured into the upper atmosphere in a band that wrapped a quarter of the planet in the space of a breath. The spores died before they finished falling. Every one of them, the blinding strains and the quieting strains, and the metal eaters and the thought eaters, 11,000 tons of contaminant bred over 9,000 years, met a wall of 2,000 degrees, and ceased to be anything but ash drifting on the high wind. The plumes that had looked so majestic from the bloom glass simply went out, like breath in a furnace, and the upper air of Earth glowed a brief and terrible orange and then was clean. Oss made a sound the creches did not have a word for. Coordinator, the drone whispered. The seeding. All of it. It is gone. Vesk stared at the bloom glass. The orange band was already fading. The blue world turned underneath it, untouched, unbothered, and the ring station hung above it like a hand laid flat over a sleeping child. Seed again, Vesk said. His voice did not shake. He would not let it shake. All carriers, full plumes, they cannot burn the whole sky at once. Drown it. The order went out. 100 seed carriers opened their vents this time, not 40, and the plumes that poured forth were vast enough to be seen from the surface, a gray shroud descending over a continent. The Arcticus unfolded its second weapon spine, and its third, and its fourth. Imre Solano watched the boards climb to full power and felt the ship come all the way awake under her hands, and for the first time in 30 years of training, she let it off the leash by a single notch. Not all the way, never all the way, but enough. Burn the sky, she said quietly, all of it they're reaching for. Keep this world clean. The ring blazed. From the surface it would have looked, to anyone who dared to watch, like a second dawn breaking from the wrong direction, a ring of fire wrapped around the planet's shoulder, 100 kilometers up, catching every gray plume the Imperium poured down, and turning it to nothing before it could touch a single drop of water or a single breath of air. The mycelid had brought enough spore to compost a world. The world did not get composted. The sky ate the spore, because the sky belonged to the Arcticus now, and the Arcticus had been built by people who had buried a thing this hungry before and had sworn on the graves of the First War that they would never let it land again. In the maintenance bay, behind the opened wall, Garrick Pell found himself looking at a thing he had no words for. The opened panel was not a panel, it was a doorway, and beyond it ran a corridor he had never known existed, threaded down the inside of the spine, lit a soft and living green. And the corridor was full of machines, beautiful ugly machines, the auxiliary heart of a weapon spine, valves the size of his torso and conduits thick as his waist, and every one of them was working, was straining, was running hotter than any machine Garrick had ever been allowed near. A board beside the doorway lit with his name, not his rank, his name, Garrick Pell, it said, as if it had been waiting for him specifically, and below it, a single line of instruction in plain, hard words. Spine Segment 9 Auxiliary. Warden pairing unavailable. Manual tender required. You are the nearest qualified hand. Garrick understood then, in the way a man understands a thing he has spent his whole life refusing to look at. Hearthring had 11 wardens, and 11 wardens could not be everywhere, and the ring was 4,000 meters of waking war. And somewhere in the design of all this, 190 years ago, someone had known that when the day came, the wardens would not be enough. They would need hands, ordinary hands. The cooks and the clerks and the medics and the fitters, the 212 people the mycelid had not even bothered to count, because the Imperium did not count prey, it composted it. Spine Segment 9 was failing. Garrick could see it in the board, in the red creeping up the edges of the readout. The weapon spine had been asleep 190 years, and now it was running hotter than its makers had ever dared, and the auxiliary heart that fed it was choking, and there was no warden near enough to tend it, and if Spine Segment 9 went dark, a quarter of the sky would go dark with it, and the gray plumes would find their way through the gap. There was a man at a console somewhere who was supposed to do this. There was supposed to be a warden. There was not. There was Garrick Pell, fitter 3rd grade, with a wrench in his hand and bad knees and a back that told him the weather. He looked at the board for one long second. Then he set down the wrench, because the wrench was no good here, and he stepped through the wall into the burning green corridor, and he went to work on the heart of a weapon he had not known he was standing inside for 19 years. He did not think of himself as brave. He thought of the seal weeping coolant onto the deck behind him, and how a weeping seal became a flood, became a fire, and how this was the same problem, only the fire was the whole sky, and a man who fixed old things did not get to choose which old thing decided to start working again on the worst possible day. He read the board. He found the choked valve. He braced his bad knees against a conduit that was too hot to touch with a bare hand, and he reached for the manual tender wheel, and high above his head, 90 kilometers above the surface of the world he had never once thought of as something worth dying for, spine segment 9 of the Arcticus stuttered, faltered, and held. The sky over the Eastern Ocean stayed clean. Garrick Pell, who was not a soldier, who wanted that understood, kept it that way with his hands. On the eternal bloom, Coordinator Ulthon Vesk watched 2 seedings die in the high air and made the only decision the doctrine allowed. "We have been gentle," he told his bridge, and the lie sat poorly even in his own thorax. "We will stop being gentle. Bring the spore lances forward. We will not seed the air. We will lance the station directly, crack the ring open, and let its own air carry the contaminant inside. Compost it from within. The world can wait. The guard dies first." The doctrine said this too, somewhere in the captured trade chatter and the war records of 9,000 years. The Mycelid Imperium remembered every world it had ever swallowed, every defense it had ever overcome, every clever last stand of every prey world that had thought itself the exception. The memory was the faith. The faith said no guard had ever held. The faith said the doctrine did not fail. The faith, Vesk would learn in the next 90 seconds, had a hole in it shaped exactly like the first war, the one humanity had won so quietly that the Imperium had recorded it as a withdrawal. "Spore lances forward," Vesk said again, because the bridge had not moved, because Oss was staring at the bloom glass with its fronds gone white. "Coordinator," the drone whispered, "the ring, it is turning to face us." 4,000 meters of waking warship, slow and patient and utterly without fear, rolled in its low orbit until the open end of its weapon spines pointed up and out, away from the world it was protecting, and toward the 1,100 hulls of the Mycelid Imperium hanging in the dark. The Arcticus had spent the first 30 seconds of the harvest keeping the sky clean. It was done with the sky now. The Mycelid did not name their ships for glory. They named them for what they were for. The eternal bloom was a seed carrier. The patient soil was a spore spire. The vessel that hung at the leading edge of the spiral, the first hull to die, had been called Gentle Decay, and its coordinator had been so certain of an easy harvest that he had ordered the creche vats opened on the way in, so that fresh younglings could watch their first world fall. 40 of those younglings were aboard Gentle Decay when the Arcticus took it. They did not understand what they were watching. They understood only that the prey world was not behaving the way the doctrine promised, that the sky over the blue planet was burning the wrong color, and that the elders around them had gone quiet in a way the creches had never shown them. Then Gentle Decay lost cohesion, and the younglings went with it, and that was the first thing the Imperium would have to explain to itself afterward, in the long silence that followed, that it had brought its children to a harvest, the way it always had, because a harvest had never once been dangerous. Coordinator Ulthon Vesk did not know about the younglings on Gentle Decay until later, until the recordings were reassembled out in the dark by an empire trying to understand its own death. He knew only that the leading edge of his spiral had gone dark, and that the spiral was the doctrine, and that the doctrine did not go dark. He had given 9 harvests to the Imperium. He had walked the ash of 9 worlds, and grown the obedient soil afterward, and recited the faith to younglings in the creche vats, exactly as the elders had recited it to him. He believed it the way a stone believes in falling. The doctrine did not fail. The spiral always closed. The prey world always learned to be afraid too late, and the Imperium always tucked it in. So when Oss reported that the ring station's reactor signature had not stopped climbing, Vesk's first instinct was not fear. It was correction. The drone had read the instruments wrong. The station was a relay and a museum. The broadcast said so, and the broadcasts of prey worlds were always honest, because prey worlds did not yet know they were prey. He ordered a second scan. Oss ran it, and the numbers came back worse, and Vesk ordered a third, and the third was worse still, and somewhere between the second scan and the third, the coordinator of the Eternal Bloom began, for the first time in his obedient life, to entertain the possibility that the file on this world was wrong. He pushed the thought away. He was good at pushing thoughts away. The creches bred that into a coordinator along with the faith, because a coordinator who entertained doubts during a harvest was a coordinator who hesitated, and the doctrine had no clause for hesitation. There was only the spiral, and the seeding, and the patient swallowing of a world. He ordered the seeding to begin. And the sky burned, and the doctrine met the museum, and Ulthon Vesk discovered that there are some thoughts a coordinator cannot push away, because they are not thoughts at all. They are the readings on a bloom glass, showing 40 seed carriers worth of spore going out like breath in a furnace, and no amount of faith makes a reading say something other than what it says. The Mycelid Imperium was 9,000 years old. In 9,000 years it had swallowed 411 worlds. It had a memory of every one, kept in the spore creches, recited to younglings, woven into the faith. 411 worlds, and not one of them had ever burned the sky clean, until the 412th, which the catalogues called Earth, and which had been waiting for the Imperium to come back for 190 years. The first weapon spine of the Articus did not make a sound, because there is no sound in the dark between worlds, and that was the part the Mycelid would have hated most if any of them had lived to hate it. Imre Solano did not give the order to fire the way the war records said the wardens of the first war had given it, with prayers and with grief. She gave it the way a person turns a key in a lock, quiet, certain, a thing she had practiced 400 times. Spines 1 through 4, she said. Forward arc. The lances they're bringing up. Take them first. The Mycelid had begun to move their spore lances to the front of the spiral, vast slow weapons grown rather than built, each one a spire of fungal bone holding a single concentrated charge of contaminant meant to crack a hull and pour rot inside. There were 900 of them across the 1,100 ships. They were the pride of the Imperium. They had cracked the crust of 9 worlds. The Articus reached out across 200 kilometers of empty dark and touched the leading spore lance with a beam of focused force that humanity did not have a polite word for, and the spore lance came apart. It did not explode the way a powder weapon explodes. It simply lost cohesion, all at once, the fungal bone that had been grown over 40 years, flashing from solid to vapor in less time than it takes a heart to beat, and the contaminant charge it carried went with it. 8 tons of metal-eating spore boiling away to nothing in the same instant, because the beam that killed the lance was hot enough to kill anything organic, and the spore was, in the end, only the cleverest organic thing the galaxy had ever made. Then the second lance, then the 9th, then the 40th. The Articus did not fire one beam. It fired from every weapon spine at once, 11 of them now fully unfolded, and each spine could divide its attention the way a warden could, splitting one beam into a dozen, 100, tracking each thread to a separate target with a patience no living gunner could have matched. The First War had taught humanity that the Mycelid attacked as weather, as a spreading thing, as numbers too vast to fight one at a time. So humanity had built a weapon that did not fight one at a time either. It fought all at once. It answered weather with weather. In the bloom glass of the eternal bloom, Coordinator Ulthon Vesk watched 900 spore lances die in 11 seconds. He had no frame for it. There was nothing in 9,000 years of doctrine that described what he was seeing, because in 9,000 years it had never happened. The pride of the Imperium, the weapons that cracked worlds, simply unmade themselves across the front of his spiral, like frost burning off a window in the morning sun, and the ring station that had done it had not moved from its low orbit, had not charged, had not even seemed to hurry. "Evade," Vesk said, and now his voice did shake, and he did not care. "All ships, break the spiral, scatter, get out of its arc." The spiral was the doctrine. The spiral was 9,000 years of faith, the slow, inevitable pattern that swallowed worlds. And the spiral was the worst possible shape to be in when something started shooting, because the spiral packed 1,100 ships into a volume small enough that a single ring station, turning slowly in low orbit, could reach every one of them without ever changing its aim by more than a degree. The mycelid had never needed to scatter. The doctrine had never failed. So the doctrine had never taught them how. 1,100 ships tried to break a formation they had spent 9,000 years perfecting and had never once practiced leaving, and they fouled each other, and they crowded each other, and they presented the Arcticus with exactly the dense, slow target its makers had dreamed of when they buried it in low orbit 190 years before. Imre Solano felt the ship want to take them all. She felt it through the leash, the old patient hunger of the thing humanity had built, the part of it that did not understand mercy and never would. She held it. Not all the way. She let it take the warships, the seed carriers, the spore spires, the 1,100 hulls that had come to compost her world. But she did not let it follow the fleeing ones past the line. There was always a line. That was the bargain. That was the difference between the Arcticus and the thing the mycelid worshipped. The Arcticus had a warden, and the warden held a line, and on the far side of the line a ship that ran would be allowed to run. Almost none of them ran in time. The Arcticus burned through the spiral from its leading edge inward, weapon spine by weapon spine, beam by dividing beam, and the 1,100 ships of the mycelid Imperium came apart the way their lances had come apart, all at once, cohesion lost, fungal bone flashing to vapor, 11,000 tons of sleeping contaminant boiling away in the same fire that took the hulls that carried it. The spore never had a chance to wake. The water it needed was 90 kilometers below and falling further out of reach with every hull that died. It burned dry and dormant in the high dark, and the dark, for once, stayed clean. 40 seconds. From the moment the ring turned to face them, 40 seconds. In Spine Segment 9, Garrick Pell did not see any of it. He saw a board, and a choked valve, and the manual tinder wheel he was hauling on with both hands, and both bad knees braced against a conduit that had burned the skin of his forearm where he had touched it without meaning to. He smelled his own arm. He kept hauling. The board in front of him showed him nothing of the armada dying overhead. It showed him one thing, the temperature of the spine he was tending, and that temperature was climbing toward a red line that meant the weapon spine would crack itself apart from its own heat, and a cracked spine meant a dark spine, and a dark spine meant a hole in the wall of fire that was eating the Imperium one ship at a time. "Warden control," he said into the local channel, because they had told him in the dull, boring drill that if you ever found yourself doing this, you talked, you did not suffer in silence. The wardens needed to know. "Warden control. Spine 9 auxiliary. I have a tender on the line. She's running hot. I can hold her, but I can't cool her. The flow's fighting me." The woman's voice came back, calm as a hand on the shoulder. "Spine 9, this is Solano. I hear you. What's your name?" "Pell. Garrick Pell. I'm a fitter. I'm not. I don't do this. I fix the old freighters on the spine. I don't." "Garrick." Just his name. Steady. Cutting through. "You're doing it right now. Listen to me. I can't send you a warden. There isn't one to send. Every pairing is committed. So it's you. Spine 9 is yours. Can you hold her for 90 seconds? Garrick looked at the temperature climbing toward the red line. He looked at the manual wheel he could not turn any further. He looked at his own arm, the skin gone wrong where the conduit had kissed it. "I don't know," he said, because he was not a man who lied about machines. "Then hold her as long as you can," Solano said, "and tell me the second before you can't, and I'll bring her offline gentle, so she doesn't take you with her. Nobody on this ring dies in a spine today. Not on my watch. You understand me, Garrick?" "Yeah," Garrick said. His voice did not sound like his own. "Yeah, I understand you." He braced his knees. He hauled on the wheel. The temperature climbed, and he held it, the way he had held 100 old weeping seals over 19 years, the way a man holds a thing that is trying to break, because breaking is what old things do, and holding is what he is for. Overhead, the 800 mycelid ship died. In the bloom glass of the eternal bloom, which was now one of 40 hulls still intact out of 1100, Coordinator Ulthan Vesk watched the doctrine end. He understood, finally, what the museum had been. He understood what the word meant, the word his people had no concept for, the keeping of a dead thing on purpose. The ring station was a museum. It was the place where humanity kept the memory of the first war, the war the Imperium had recorded as a withdrawal, the war humanity had won so completely and so quietly that the only thing it had taken away was the certain knowledge that the rot would come back, and the patience to build something that would be waiting when it did. 190 years. They had built a weapon that could end his fleet in 40 seconds, and then they had set it to spin in low orbit and pretend to be a relay, and they had waited 190 years for him to arrive, certain he would, because the doctrine never failed and a people who understood the doctrine knew it would bring the Imperium back to the one world that had ever turned it away. They had not been hoping he would not come. They had been waiting for him to. "Os," Vesk said. The scan tender did not answer. The scan tender was gone, its console dark, taken in the last sweep along with the spore spire it had been grown aboard. Vesk was alone on a bridge built for 40, watching the blue world turn beneath a ring of fire, and for the first time in his long, obedient life, he felt the thing his people bred their prey to feel, and had never once felt themselves. He felt afraid. He had time for one more order. The doctrine had a final clause, a thing the creches taught but no coordinator had ever used, because no coordinator had ever needed it. The seed of last resort. When all is lost, when the hull is the last thing standing, you do not flee, because the Imperium does not flee. You release everything. You open every bulb in the hold at once, and you ride the hull down into the prey world's air, and you become the last spore, the one that grows from your own death, so that even in defeat, the Imperium composts. Vesk reached for the claws. 11,000 tons of contaminant sat in the hold of the Eternal Bloom, the largest single store in the fleet, every strain the Imperium had ever bred, and if he could drive the hull down into the wet, warm air of the prey world before the ring killed him, the seed of last resort would do what 9,000 years of doctrine had failed to do this day. It would land. He turned the hull toward the planet and opened the growing vents, and 4,000 meters of waking warship, turning slowly in low orbit, saw exactly what he was doing, because the people who built the Arcticus had read the same doctrine he had, in the war records of the First War, where one mycelid coordinator had tried the seed of last resort above a human colony and had very nearly succeeded. They had a countermeasure for the seed of last resort. They had built it into the ring 190 years ago, and they had never had a chance to use it. It was called Spine Segment 9. While Garrick Pell braced his bad knees in Spine Segment 9 and the sky over the Eastern Ocean stayed clean because of it, the rest of Hearthring's 212 fought the same war he did, in the same way, with their hands. The drill was real now, and the drill had a shape, and the shape was not what anyone outside the ring would have imagined. There were no soldiers running with rifles. There were no Marines repelling boarders. The mycelid did not board. The mycelid composted, and you did not fight compost with a rifle. You fought it with cooling, and flow, and the patient tending of machines that had slept too long and now had to run too hot, and that was a fitter's war, a cook's war, a clerk's war. It was the war of people who kept things running. In the upper galley, a cook named Doss had abandoned his ovens 40 minutes ago, and was now elbow-deep in the auxiliary heart of Spine Segment 3, doing for that spine what Garrick did for his, because the drill that everyone treated as a joke had assigned the upper galley crew to Spine 3, and Doss had grumbled about it twice a year for 9 years, and had still, when the handprint plate lit green, put his hand on it without hesitating, because some part of him had always known the grumbling was a thing he did, instead of admitting he was afraid. In the records office, a clerk named Vey held a flow valve open with a length of pipe and her own body weight, because the valve's actuator had seized after 190 years and there was no time to free it properly, and she stood there leaning on a pipe with her whole weight while spine segment 6 fired over her head, and she counted, out loud, the way the drill had taught, because counting kept you from listening to the sounds the spine made. In the medical bay 2 corridors from Garrick, Medic Burhane had no spine to tend. The medic's assignment in the drill was different. The medics waited. They waited at the foot of each spine corridor with their kits ready, because the drill book said, in plain hard words, that tending a spine past its limits was dangerous to the tender, and that when a tender came out hurt, a medic should be there, and when a tender did not come out at all, a medic should be the one to know it first, and to log it, and to carry it. Burhane waited at the foot of the spine 9 corridor. She had heard the channel. She had heard Solano ask the fitter his name, and she had heard the fitter say he was not a soldier, that he fixed the old freighters on the spine, and she had recognized the voice, because the voice belonged to the man who had fixed her coffee maker in the mess 2 weeks ago without being asked and without saying anything. She stood at the foot of the corridor with her kit ready, and she listened to the channel, and when Solano said mark in 3 and counted down, Burhane understood what was about to happen before the count reached 1, because a medic learns the shape of these moments, and she put her hand flat against the corridor wall, on her side of it, as if she could reach through 4 meters of bone steel and the heat of a firing spine, and put her hand on the shoulder of the man on the other side. She could not. No one could. That was the cost of the war the ring fought, the quiet war of hands and flow and cooling. It was a war you could lose people in even when you won, because the machines did not care who was tending them, and a spine that cracked took whatever hand was holding it, and the only mercy in the whole design was that someone like Burhane would be there at the foot of the corridor, so that the hand that held the door would not be unwitnessed when it let go. She heard the spine fire at full. She felt the corridor wall go hot under her palm. She heard, faintly, through the channel that Garrick had never closed, the sound of the auxiliary heart coming apart, and then she heard nothing, which was the worst sound a medic ever heard. Burhane stayed at the foot of the corridor with her hand on the hot wall for a long time after that, longer than the drill required, because the drill could tell her where to stand, but it could not tell her how to leave. When she finally took her hand down, the print of it stayed on the wall a moment in the heat haze and then faded, the way everything fades, and she picked up her kit that she had not gotten to use and walked back to her bay and sat with the picture of her daughter and waited for Warden Control to tell her what she already knew. That was the war the Mycelid never saw, never counted, never imagined. They saw a ring of fire eat their fleet in 41 seconds, and they thought the fire was the weapon. The fire was not the weapon. The weapon was 212 people who kept things running, who had practiced a boring drill twice a year for years and grumbled about it, and who, when the worst morning came, put their hands on the handprint plates without hesitating and held the spines past every limit their makers had set, because the spines needed holding and there was no one else. The Articus was 4,000 meters of bone steel and folded weapon spine, but the Articus did not fight alone. It never had. It had wardens to choose and hands to hold, and on the morning the rot came back, the hands held, every one of them, and the ones who paid for the holding paid it the way Garrick Pell paid it, quietly, at a wheel, for a world they had never thought of as worth dying for, until the moment they found that they were dying for it, and found that they did not mind. Garrick Pell did not know that the spine he was holding had a second purpose. Nobody had told him, because there had been no time, and because the people who built the ring had never imagined that the man tending spine segment 9 on the worst day in 2 centuries would be a fitter who did not know what he was standing inside. Solano knew. Solano saw the eternal bloom turn toward the planet and open its vents, and she read the size of the contaminant store inside that single hull, and she understood in one cold instant what the coordinator was attempting, because she had memorized the First War the way Imre Solano memorized everything, completely and without comfort. The seed of last resort. One hull, the largest store in the fleet, driving down into the air on a suicide fall, opening every bulb at once. If it reached the lower atmosphere before the ring could stop it, the spore would land. Not all of it. Not enough to compost the world, but enough to seed an ocean, enough to take a coastline, enough that the first war would not have been the last, and 190 years of waiting would have bought humanity a wound instead of a clean victory. There was exactly one weapon spine on the Arcticus positioned to intercept a hull falling on that vector at that angle into that quarter of the air. Spine Segment 9. The same spine that was already running past its red line. The same spine being held offline from dark by the bare hands of a man named Garrick Pell. Solano did not waste a second on the unfairness of it. She keyed the channel. "Garrick," she said, "I need more from you, and I need it now, and there's no gentle way to ask." In the burning green corridor, Garrick's arms were shaking, and the temperature on his board had crept to a finger's width below the red line, and the skin of his forearm had stopped hurting, which he knew, the way a man who works with his hands knows, was a worse sign than if it had hurt more. "Go ahead," he said. "There's a hull falling on your quarter, the big one, the flagship. It's going to try to drive its whole hold down into the air and open it where I can't burn it clean. Spine 9 is the only spine that can reach it. I need your spine to fire, Garrick, and I need it to fire at full, and it's already past where it's supposed to be." Garrick looked at the red line. He understood machines, and he understood that what she was asking was to take a thing that was already failing and ask it to do the one thing most likely to finish failing it. "If I open her up to full," he said slowly, "she cracks, you know that. I can feel her. She's done. One full shot and she cracks." "I know," Solano said. "And if she cracks while I'm standing in here, I know that too." A breath. The first crack in the calm, and she let him hear it, because she was not a woman who hid the cost from a man she was spending. "Garrick, I'm not going to tell you it's safe. It isn't. If that spine fires at full, the auxiliary heart goes with it, and you are standing in the auxiliary heart, and I cannot get you out in time. I've already run it. There's no time." The corridor hummed around him, the deep, patient hum he had felt in his teeth for 19 years, the hum of the old girl who had been pretending to be a museum his whole adult life. Garrick Pell, fitter 3rd grade, 46 years old, with bad knees and a burned arm, and a personnel file that said Legacy Systems, Mechanical, stood in the heart of a weapon he had not known he was inside, and he did the arithmetic. One hull falling on the air, a coastline, an ocean, the start of a wound that would not heal in his lifetime or his children's. He did not have children. He thought, absurdly, of the families on the spine, the cooks and the clerks who did have children, the medic 2 bays over who showed everyone the picture of her daughter whether they wanted to see it or not. He thought of the wet, loud, crowded little world 90 kilometers below, which he had never once thought of as something worth dying for, and found that he was thinking of it now, and that the thought did not frighten him the way he would have expected. "How long," he said, "after I fire, before she cracks?" "Seconds, maybe less. Garrick, I have to give the order to someone else if you can't. There is no one else. There's no warden. It's you, or it's the coast." "Don't," Garrick said. "Don't give it to anybody else. There isn't anybody else. There's just me and the wheel." He almost laughed. It came out wrong. "Story of my whole damn career." He set his feet. He found the throat of the valve he had been choking down to hold the spine offline from dark, the same valve, and he understood now that holding it closed had been keeping the spine alive, and opening it all the way was going to be the last thing he ever did with these hands. "Solano," he said, "I'm here. That medic on spine 9, Burhane, she's got a kid. She shows everybody the picture. When this is over, you tell her." He stopped. He did not know what to tell her. He was not a man with words. "Tell her the fitter held the door. That's all. Tell her the fitter held the door." "I'll tell her," Solano said, and her voice was steady again, because she was a warden, and a warden held the line, even when the line ran straight through her own chest. "Garrick Pell, on my mark, full open. The world's going to remember you held this door. I'm going to remember. Mark in 3. Garrick put both hands on the wheel. 2. He thought of the weeping seal back in the bay, still dripping coolant onto the deck, the small, ordinary problem he had been fixing when the sky tried to fall. He thought of how a weeping seal becomes a flood, becomes a fire, and how this was the same problem, only bigger, only the last one. He thought with great and sudden clarity that he was a fitter, and that a fitter's whole life was holding old things together one more day, one more shift, one more terrible morning, and that there were worse things to be on the day the rot came back than the man who held the door. Mark. Garrick Pell opened the valve all the way. The auxiliary heart of spine segment 9 roared awake under his hands. Full flow, full charge, 190 years of patience pouring into one shot, and Garrick held the wheel through the worst of it, because the wheel needed holding, and there was no one else, and 90 kilometers above the Eastern Ocean, the 9th weapon spine of the Arcticus fired at full, for the first and only time in its life. The beam crossed the dark and found the eternal bloom. Coordinator Ulthon Vesk had time to see it coming. He had driven the flagship down through the high air, vents open, every bulb in the hold blown wide, 11,000 tons of contaminant streaming behind the hull in a gray banner that should have been the death of a coastline, and for one instant he believed the doctrine would hold, that even in defeat the Imperium would compost, that the faith of 9,000 years would be redeemed by his fall. Then Spine Segment 9 found him, and the beam that Garrick Pell had bought with his hands was not a beam meant to crack a hull. It was the countermeasure for the seed of last resort, built into the ring 190 years before by people who had watched a mycelid coordinator very nearly seed a human colony this exact way and had sworn it would never happen again. It was not hot, it was vast. It was a wall of directed force that caught the eternal bloom and the gray banner of spore streaming behind it, and did not vaporize them. It folded them away from the air. The hull and its contaminant, the largest store in the fleet, the seed of last resort itself, were caught in mid-fall and turned, all that mass and all that rot redirected up and out, away from the wet warm air that would have woken it, flung back into the cold clean dark, where spore could not grow, and a coordinator could not breathe, and the doctrine could finally, completely, end. Vesk felt the world fall away beneath him. He felt the blue planet shrink in the bloom glass instead of swell, felt the wet air he had reached for pulled back out of his grasp, felt 9,000 years of certainty come apart in his thorax as the eternal bloom rose helpless into the dark on a wall of human force, every bulb in its hold blown empty, 11,000 tons of contaminants scattering harmless into a vacuum that would let none of it live. He had time for one last thought, and it was not a prayer, because the mycelid did not pray. It was a correction, a revision to the faith, made far too late to matter, the first honest thing 9,000 years of doctrine had ever produced. The file was wrong. It was not a withdrawal. They beat us. They beat us the first time, and they have been waiting ever since, and they have never once stopped being the people who beat us. Then the dark took the eternal bloom, and the gray banner of the last spore scattered into nothing, and the seed of last resort came to nothing, and the blue world below turned on, untouched, 90 kilometers of clean air between it and a single ring of fire that had, in the space of 41 seconds, ended the oldest empire in the dark. In Spine Segment 9, Garrick Pell felt the spine crack. He had told her it would, and it did, and there was a strange small comfort in being right about a machine one last time. The auxiliary heart came apart around him exactly the way the board had promised, and Garrick Pell, fitter third grade, who had held the door, did not feel most of it, and the part he did feel did not last long, and his last clear thought before the green corridor went white was that he had not, in the end, been afraid. He had only been a man who fixed old things, holding one together one more morning, the way he always had, the way he was for. The hum of the Arcticus went on around him, deep and patient, the way it had hummed for 190 years, the way it would hum for 190 more. It hummed him out. There is a way to describe what the Arcticus did to the spiral that the mycelid survivors used afterward, when they tried to make the creches understand, and the way they described it was not as a battle. A battle has two sides that act. What happened above the blue world had only one side that acted, and the survivors, lacking any better word, called it a tide going out. The spiral had been a tide coming in, slow and total, 1,100 hulls in the pattern that had swallowed worlds for 9,000 years. And then the ring turned to face it, and the tide simply went out, ship by ship, from the leading edge inward, and there was nothing the spiral could do, because the spiral was not built to do anything except come in. It had no defense. It had never needed one. The doctrine was the defense. The faith was the armor, and faith is poor armor against a weapon that has read your faith and built itself specifically to end it. The Articus fired from 11 weapon spines, and each spine divided its beam the way a warden divides attention, and the math of it was the math humanity had worked out in the years after the First War, the cold patient arithmetic of how to fight weather with weather. One ring station could not fight 1,100 ships if it fought them one at a time. So it did not fight them one at a time, it fought them all at once, 100 threads of force from each spine, 1,100 threads in total, one for every hull, every thread tracking its target with the inhuman patience of a thing that had nothing but patience, having slept on nothing but patience for 190 years. The seed carriers died first, after the lances, because the seed carriers held the spore, and the people who built the Articus had understood that the spore was the real enemy. The hulls were only the delivery. So the Articus killed the delivery and the cargo together, 11,000 tons of contaminant, flashing to ash inside the hulls that carried it, before a single bulb could open, before a single strain could wake, before a single spore could find the water it needed to begin its 9,000-year work. The spore spires died next, the vast slow vessels that did nothing but grow more spore, drifting at the heart of the spiral like queens in a hive. They had no weapons at all. They had never needed weapons. The spiral protected them, and the spiral was gone, and they hung in the dark for the last few seconds of their existence, with nothing to protect them and no way to flee, because a thing built only to grow does not know how to run. And the warships, such as the Mycelid had, the coordinator hulls and the escort spires, died trying to do the one thing the doctrine had never taught them, which was to scatter, and they fouled each other in the trying, and the fouling held them in place for the threads of force that found them one after another, until the spiral that had come in like a tide had gone out like a tide, and the dark above the blue world was empty. From the surface, 90 kilometers below, it would have looked like a strange second aurora, a ring of cold fire wrapped around the planet's shoulder, flickering and dividing and flickering again, beautiful and silent and brief. The people on the surface did not know what they were seeing. Most of them never knew it had happened at all. They went on with their loud, crowded, ordinary lives, and above them the museum that was not a museum killed the oldest empire in the dark and kept their air clean, and the only sign of it any of them saw was a light in the sky that was gone before most of them thought to look up. That was the bargain too, in its way. The people the ring protected were not supposed to live in fear. That was the difference between what humanity had built and what the Mycelid worshipped. The Mycelid bred their prey to be afraid, tucked worlds in with terror before they composted them. Humanity built a thing that let its people not be afraid, that did its terrible work quietly, above the air, so that the children on the surface could grow up never knowing how close the rot had come, could grow up loud and crowded and unguarded and free, which was the whole point of guarding them at all. Imre Solano watched the tide go out from the heart of the ring, and she did not feel triumph, because a warden was trained out of triumph, the way a surgeon is trained out of squeamishness. She felt the leash in her hands, and the ship's old hunger straining against it, and her own steady refusal to let it all the way off. And underneath all of that, she felt the thing she had been built by 30 years of training to feel, and nothing else. She felt responsible for the threads of force, and for the 1,100 hulls, and for the younglings she did not yet know were aboard Gentle Decay, and for the hands holding the spines, and for Garrick Pell most of all, whose name was glowing green on her board, whose door was holding, whose life she was about to spend because there was no one else and no other way. A warden does not get to feel triumph. A warden gets to feel responsible. That is the price of holding the leash, and Imra Solano had agreed to pay it 30 years ago, the day she first put her hand on the strap, and she paid it now, fully, in the only coin a warden has, which is the willingness to give the order and then carry it for the rest of her life. The tide went out. The dark went empty, and Imre Solano carried it, the way she would carry it always, the way the wardens before her had carried their own quiet wars, the way the next warden would carry whatever the next morning brought, 190 years from now, or however long the rot took, to forget its own instruction and come back to the one door it had never gotten through. 41 seconds after the ring turned to face them, the dark above Earth was empty. Not quiet. Empty. There is a difference, and Imre Solano had spent 30 years learning it. Quiet is a thing that can break. Empty is a thing that is finished. The 1,100 hulls of the Mycalid Imperium were not retreating, were not regrouping, were not licking wounds in the high orbit. They were gone. Every one. Vapor and scattered spore drifting cold and dormant on the solar wind, and the few dozen that had broken from the spiral early enough to cross the line were running, and Solano let them run, because that was the bargain, because a ship on the far side of the line was allowed to live and carry the story home. She wanted them to carry it home. She wanted the Imperium, whatever was left of it out there in the dark, to hear from its own survivors what had happened above the blue world. Not a withdrawal this time. Not a thing they could record as a strategic adjustment and forget for another 190 years. She wanted it remembered correctly, in their own voices, the day the doctrine met the museum, and the museum was not asleep. The Articus folded its weapon spines, one by one, the way a hand closes after it has done a hard thing. The fields that had wrapped a quarter of the sky in fire dimmed and went cold. The ring slowed its turn until it sat once more in its patient low orbit, 4,000 meters of bone steel, humming, looking for all the dark like a relay and a museum, exactly what it had always claimed to be. Solano sat in the heart of it and did not move for a long moment. Her hands were still on the leash. She had never let the ship all the way off, not once, not even when it wanted the running ships, not even when it would have been easy. That was the difference. That was the whole difference between the Articus and the thing it had killed. The Mycalid worshipped a hunger and called it doctrine. Humanity had built a hunger and put a warden's hand on its throat, and never once, in 190 years, taken that hand away. Then she keyed the all-station channel, and her voice was steady, because a warden's voice is steady, even when the warden is not. All Hearthring personnel, this is warden control. The threat is ended. The world is clean. The Articus is returning to standby. A breath. We did the drill once, for real. We go home now. The cheering started somewhere down the spine, in the support bays, the cooks and the clerks and the medics, 212 people the Imperium had never bothered to count, and it ran the length of the ring and came back. Solano led it. They had earned it. Then, when it had run its course, she did the part of her duty that no drill had ever made easier. Spine 9 personnel, she said, report. Silence on the channel. Not the empty kind. The other kind, the kind that breaks. Spine 9 auxiliary, Solano said, and there was no calm in the world that could keep her voice fully level now, and she did not try, because the man deserved better than a level voice. Garrick Pell, report. Nothing. She had known. She had run it, she had told him she had run it. There had been no time, and there had been no way, and a full shot from a cracked spine took the auxiliary heart and everyone in it. She had known when she gave the order. She had given it anyway, because the alternative was a coastline and an ocean and the start of a wound that would not heal, and Garrick Pell had done the arithmetic himself and reached the same answer she had, and had not let her give the order to anyone else, because there had not been anyone else, only him and the wheel. Imre Solano put her hand flat on the console, over the readout that still said, in patient green, Spine Segment 9 Auxiliary, Manual Tender, and she sat with it for a moment that was hers alone. Then she found the duty roster, and the medical bay assignment, and a name. Burhane. Medic, Spine 9 support, 2 bays from the auxiliary corridor. A woman who showed everyone the picture of her daughter whether they wanted to see it or not. Solano keyed a private channel. Medic, Berhane, this is Warden Control. Imre Solano. She closed her eyes. I have a message for you. It's from the fitter who tended Spine 9, from Garrick Pell. She made herself say the rest exactly the way he had asked, no more and no less, because a man's last words are a thing you carry exactly, or you do not carry at all. He wanted you to know. The fitter held the door. That's all he said. The fitter held the door. The channel was quiet for a long time. When Berhane's voice came back, it was thick and small. He fixed my coffee maker, she said, which was not what anyone would have expected, and was, Solano understood, exactly the right thing. 2 weeks ago, in the mess. He didn't have to, he just saw it was broken, and he fixed it, and he didn't say anything. That was him, he just fixed things. A breath that was almost a sob and almost a laugh. Tell him. She stopped, because there was no one to tell, and that was the whole of it. I'll remember it for him, Solano said. We all will. The ring will remember. That's what the ring is for. That was true, in a way Berhane could not have known, and Solano did, because Solano had memorized the first war, and the bargain, and the purpose of the thing she served. The Arcticus was a museum. It kept things on purpose. It kept the memory of the first war so that the second time the rot came, humanity would be ready, and it would keep the memory of this morning too, the 41 seconds and the 1100 hulls and the fitter who held the door, so that 190 years from now, when the next warden sat where Imre Solano sat, and the proximity tone meant something again, the name Garrick Pell would still be in the heart of the ship, in the green readout of Spine Segment 9, waiting. Out in the dark, a dozen mycelid hulls fled toward home, and aboard the largest of them a young scan tender named Os, who had been on a different ship than its coordinator and had lived because of it, sat alone with the recording of 41 seconds and tried to understand what it would say when it reached the spore creches. It did not have the words. The creches had not taught the words, because the creches had never needed them. There was no mycelid concept for a guard that held. There was no concept for a weapon that could be hungry and leashed at the same time, that could kill 1100 hulls in 41 seconds and then let a dozen run, on purpose, so that the running ones could carry the truth. There was no concept for keeping a dead thing, a memory, a war, on purpose, for 190 years, so that you would be ready when the rot came back. The Imperium had a memory of every world it had ever swallowed. Os understood now that the memory had been wrong about exactly one of them. The first war had not been a withdrawal. It had been a defeat, the only defeat in 9,000 years, and the prey world that had handed it to them had not celebrated, and had not boasted, and had not gone looking for revenge. It had simply built a thing in low orbit and set it to spin and pretended to sleep, and waited, with a patience that put the Imperium's 9,000 years to shame, for the doctrine to bring the rot back to the one door it had never gotten through. They had counted on it. Os carried the recording home, and the Imperium, what was left of it, revised the faith, because there was nothing else it could do. In the new file, the one Os helped to write, the blue world was marked differently than any world had ever been marked in 9,000 years of cataloging. It was not marked as prey. It was not marked as harvested. It was marked with a single instruction, the first of its kind, the only honest thing the doctrine had ever produced. Do not return. They are not asleep. They have never once been asleep. They are only waiting. And the Imperium, for the first time in its long swallowing history, obeyed a border it had not drawn itself, because a people who have lost everything they believed will sometimes, at the very end, learn the one thing their faith never taught them, which is when to stop. Aboard Hearthring, the work of an ordinary morning resumed, the way it always does after the extraordinary ones, because rings do not run themselves, and the dead are honored best by the living who keep going. The cooks went back to the mess. The clerks went back to the logs. The medics went back to their bays, and Medic Berhane sat for a while with the picture of her daughter, and then put it away and went back to work. because that was what the fitter would have done, and somewhere in the doing of it she stopped crying. And in the heart of the ring, Imre Solano took her hands off the leash, one finger at a time, the way she had been trained, and let the Articus settle back into its long, patient sleep. The boards dimmed, the weapon spines folded fully away, the dead boards with the brass plates that said "Do Not Service" went dark again, all but one. Solano left one lit, spine segment 9. She left the green readout glowing, with the name in it, and she logged the reason in the warden's record where the next warden would find it, 190 years from now or however long it took for the proximity tone to mean something again. "This board stays lit," she wrote. "A man held this door. When you wake the Articus, you wake him too. Tell him the world is still clean. He'll want to know." She closed the log. The ring turned in its low orbit, humming its deep, patient hum, 90 kilometers of clean air between it and the wet, loud, crowded world it had been built to keep, the world that did not know, would never fully know, how close the rot had come, or who had held it back. Earth turned on beneath the ring, blue and oblivious and alive, and the dark above it was empty, the good kind of empty, the finished kind. Far out in that dark, a dozen fleeing hulls carried the truth home to an empire that would never come back, and the truth they carried was simple, and it was the only truth that had ever mattered, and a young scan tender named Os would spend the rest of its life trying to make the creches understand it. There was a question the mycelid Imperium would spend the rest of its long, shrinking life trying to answer, and the question was this: how had a prey world built a thing like the Articus, and then hidden it for 190 years without the doctrine ever knowing? The answer was the First War, and the answer was patience, and the answer was a kind of mind the Imperium had never possessed, and could not, even at the end, fully comprehend. The First War had been small, by Imperium reckoning. A single seeding fleet, 400 hulls, sent to compost a young world that had only just learned to put ships in the dark above its own air. The doctrine had expected an easy harvest. The doctrine had been wrong, and the wrongness had been so total and so quiet that the Imperium, lacking any concept for defeat, had filed the whole event as a withdrawal and moved on to the next world without ever asking why the fleet had not come home. What the doctrine never learned was what humanity had done in the years after. It had not celebrated, it had not built a monument, or boasted in its broadcasts, or gone hunting through the dark for the empire that had tried to compost it. It had done something the Imperium would have found incomprehensible, something that ran against every instinct 9,000 years of swallowing had bred. It had assumed the rot would come back. It had assumed, and then it had prepared, with a patience that should not have been possible for a species that lived as short and loud and crowded as humanity did. It had built the Articus, and disguised it as a relay and a museum, because a thing that looks harmless is not attacked, and a thing that is not attacked has time to wait. And then it had set the ring to spin in low orbit, and it had waited, generation after generation, warden after warden, for 190 years, never letting the disguise slip, never letting the wait become legend, never letting the certainty fade. That was the part the Imperium could not understand. Not the weapon. The Imperium understood weapons. What it could not understand was the waiting. 190 years was longer than any human lifetime. The men and women who built the Articus had died without seeing it wake. The wardens who trained on it in the first decades had grown old and been replaced by wardens who had never met them, who trained in turn and grew old and were replaced again, 11 generations of wardens passing the leash hand to hand, each one believing, against all the evidence of 190 quiet years, that the rot would come back on their watch. Imre Solano was the 11th warden to hold her quarter of the leash, and she had spent 30 years certain the morning would never come, and she had trained for it anyway, every day, because that was the bargain her predecessors had kept, and she would not be the one to break it. When the proximity tone finally meant something, she was ready, because every warden before her had refused to assume she would not be. The mycelid had a memory, the humans had a promise. The two are not the same, and the difference is the whole story. A memory is a thing you keep about the past. A promise is a thing you keep to the future, to people you will never meet, who will never thank you, who may never even know your name. The Imperium had a perfect memory of 411 swallowed worlds, and it had learned nothing from any of them. Humanity had one promise, made to its own grandchildren, 190 years before those grandchildren were born, and it had kept that promise so completely that when the doctrine came back to the door held. Out in the dark, the fleeing hulls carried the recordings home, and the Imperium gathered what it could and tried to make the faith account for what had happened, and could not. There was no clause in 9,000 years of doctrine for a prey world that waited. There was no clause for a weapon that was hungry and leashed at once. There was no clause for the seed of last resort being caught and folded back into the dark by a countermeasure, built 190 years before anyone alive could have known it would be needed. The faith had no room for any of it, and a faith with no room for the truth either grows or breaks, and the Imperium was too old to grow. So it broke, quietly, the way old certain things break, not in a day, over years. The spore creches stopped reciting the doctrine with the old conviction, because the younglings asked questions the elders could not answer, questions that began with the 412th world and did not stop. Why did the file say withdrawal when the recording said defeat? Why did we bring our children to a harvest? Why did the sky burn the wrong color? Why did the door hold? The elders had no answers, because the doctrine had never needed answers before, and a faith that has never needed answers does not survive its first real question. The Imperium did not vanish. Empires rarely do. But it stopped swallowing worlds, because a doctrine you no longer fully believe is a poor thing to send children to die for, and word had spread, in the way word spreads even among the silent, that there was a world out at the edge of the dark with a ring around it, and the ring was a museum, and the museum was awake, and behind the museum stood a species that did not forgive, and did not forget, and did not ever stop waiting. Do not return. They are not asleep. They have never once been asleep. They are only waiting. It was the only instruction in 9,000 years that the Imperium obeyed without question, because it was the only instruction written in the voices of its own survivors, who had seen the doctrine die in 41 seconds and had come home changed. 3 days after the morning the rot came back, Imra Solano walked the length of spine segment 9 for the first time. She did not have to. The cleanup was done, the spine sealed and cooling, the auxiliary corridor where Garrick Pell had stood made safe again. There was nothing in the warden's duties that required her to walk it. She walked it anyway, alone, the way a person walks a place because not walking it would be a kind of cowardice she could not live with. The corridor was quiet now. The burning green light had gone soft and steady. The valves and conduits that Garrick had tended sat cooling in their cradles, and the manual tender wheel he had hauled on with both hands and both bad knees was just a wheel again, an ordinary piece of machinery, the kind of thing a fitter third grade would have called nothing special. There was no mark on it. The man who had held it had not left a mark, because that was not the kind of man he had been. He had left only the holding, and the door, and a world that was still clean. Solano stood at the wheel for a while. Then she did the thing she had come to do, which was to read the board one more time, the green readout that still said his name, and to make him a promise of her own. She was a warden. Wardens kept promises to the future. The Articus existed because 11 generations of them had kept a promise to grandchildren they would never meet. Now Solano made one more, a small one, the only one she had the power to make, and she made it out loud in the empty corridor, because some promises have to be said aloud or they do not count. "You're staying lit," she told the board. "I already logged it. 190 years from now, or whenever it is, the next warden's going to wake the ship, and the first thing they're going to see is this board, glowing, with your name in it, and they're going to ask why. And the log's going to tell them. A man held this door, and they're going to know, before they ever fire a shot, that this ring doesn't fight alone. It never has. It's got wardens to choose and hands to hold, and the hands are the ones who pay." She put her own hand on the wheel, the way Berhane had put her hand on the corridor wall 3 days before. You're part of the ship now, Garrick Pell. That's the only thing I can give you. You're part of the museum, and the museum keeps things on purpose. She took her hand off the wheel and walked back down the corridor, and behind her the green board glowed on, patient and steady, and it would glow on long after Imre Solano had grown old and passed the leash to the warden who came after her, and after that warden too, generation after generation, for as long as the ring turned and the rot stayed away. On the surface, 90 kilometers below, the wet, loud, crowded world went on. There was no parade, because there was no public that knew. There was a small ceremony aboard Hearthring, in the upper galley where Garrick had fixed the cook Doss's ovens more times than either of them had counted, and the cook made the meal, and the 212 who were now 211 sat together and did not talk much, because the people who keep things running are not, as a rule, people with many words. Medic Berhane brought the picture of her daughter. She showed it to the table, the way she always did, and this time no one pretended not to want to see it, and she said, in a voice that was steadier than it had been 3 days before, that she had told her daughter a story over the comm the night before. A story about a fitter who fixed a coffee maker without being asked, and who, when the worst morning came, held a door so that a little girl 90 kilometers away could grow up never knowing the rot had come. She had not told the daughter the door was a weapon spine, or that the holding had cost the fitter his life. She had told her only that there had been a man who fixed things, and who held a door, and that because he held it, the world was still here. The daughter had asked if the man was a hero. Berhane had thought about how to answer, and in the end, she had told the truth, which was the only thing she had ever been any good at telling. No, she had said. He wasn't a hero. He was a fitter. He was a man who fixed old things and never made a fuss about it, and when the door needed holding, he held it, because the door needed holding and there was no one else, and that's not the same as a hero. It's better. A hero goes looking for the door. A fitter just happens to be the nearest hand when the door needs holding, and holds it anyway, knowing he won't come back, because that's what he's for. The daughter had not fully understood. She was young, but she would, Berhane thought. Someday, when she was older, on some ordinary morning when something needed fixing, and there was no one else to fix it, she would understand exactly what her mother had meant, and she would put her hand on the wheel, because that was the kind of thing that got passed down, quietly, hand to hand, generation to generation, the way the leash got passed down among the wardens, the way the promise got passed down among the builders. That was humanity's real weapon, not the ring, not the weapon spines, not the fields that burned the sky clean, not the countermeasure that folded the seed of last resort back into the dark. Those were only steel. The real weapon was the thing that made a fitter hold a door, and a medic carry his last words, and a warden keep his board lit for 200 years, and a mother teach her daughter what the holding meant. It was the willingness, passed down through people who would never meet, to keep a promise to a future they would not live to see. The mycelid had 9,000 years, and 411 swallowed worlds, and a perfect memory of every one. Humanity had a fitter, and a door, and the simple stubborn refusal to ever let the rot land again. It turned out that was enough. It turned out that was more than enough. It turned out that 9,000 years of doctrine could die in 41 seconds against a single ring of patient fire, crewed by people who kept things running, led by a warden who never took her hand off the leash, held together at the last by a man who fixed old things and held a door he had not known he was standing in for 19 years. The Imperium had come to compost a world. It had found, instead, the one world in the dark that had been waiting for it, and the waiting had teeth, and the teeth had a warden's hand on them, and the hand never, ever let go. They sent an Imperial fleet to invade Earth. The fleet was obliterated in seconds, and the ring that did it was not even the thing the prey world was most proud of. It was only the door, and the fitter who held it, and the warden who never once took her hand off the leash, and 190 years of patience, and a memory kept on purpose, glowing green in the heart of a museum that had never, for a single instant of those 190 years, actually been asleep. The Imperium had come as weather, Humanity had answered as the dawn, and the dawn, when it is finished with the dark, does not boast, and does not chase, and does not gloat. It simply returns to its low and patient orbit, and hums, and keeps the door, and waits to do it all again, one more terrible morning, however long that morning takes to come. The Arcticus slept, but it was the kind of sleep that has one eye open, and one board lit, and one name held warm in its heart, and on the day the rot dares to come again, it will wake exactly as it woke this morning, and it will be exactly as merciless, and it will be exactly as kept, and somewhere in spine segment 9, a green light will be waiting that says a man held this door once, and the door held, and the world stayed clean. It always does. That is what the museum is for.